So to me, I think there are four really key things that are important for you as you're thinking about working remotely. I don't know about you guys, but most of my clients right now are dealing with the fact that we've all gone remote off the flip of a coin. Most organizations, when they decide to go fully remote, they have a process in place and people are learning how to do this, and there's framework that's set up, but most of us don't have that right now. So I think right now it's really important for each of us to determine what our framework is going to be and be very clear about it, to create a strategic focus, be really intentional with our workflow optimization. Then I think it's really important that we standardize our tools and technology, and that we have a really thoughtful investment of our time and energy. So those are going to be like the four things to me that make a huge impact on whether you are able to work remotely successfully or not. I love this quote by Albert Einstein. He says, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." And I think most people would agree that a lot of times operations is kind of a mess, right? There's not necessarily always a standardized version of our meeting culture, or even down to how we share and save files, something very simple like that. When you're in the office, it's not as big of a deal, but I know most of us now are really kind of feeling that push and that really heavy pressure now, because what was simple when we were all together is not so simple when everyone has so many demands with work and life and our children and just life. So I think it's really important that we think outside of the box when we are thinking about working remotely. Okay, so these are 5 things that I think are really important when you're developing a dynamic remote team culture. So the first thing that's key is intentional meeting culture. How many of you are familiar with that phrase? Maybe type a 1 if you are really familiar, and a 2 if you've never heard it before. So I love talking about intentional meeting culture. This is something that before COVID we were talking a lot about, but I would say that it's probably not as popular as it has become recently. So to me, intentional meeting culture is really developing a culture around why you meet. For example, understanding the expected outcome, what is the purpose of the meeting, the agenda. So really having a formalized, like a strategic focus on how you approach meetings as a company, opposed to somebody says, hey, I want to meet with this executive, and we just put it on the calendar. So what we're finding, and I'm sure all of you are dealing with this too, is Zoom fatigue, and you guys are going to see my daughter's cat. You have to excuse me. Say hi, everybody. Tips for working remote, right? So when you avoid Zoom fatigue, because I think a lot of times we are expected to be on camera all the time. A lot of times we kind of feel the need to have more meetings than less, but they're not always intentional. And so people can become very frustrated. And I think it's important that we think about that, just not from our own perspective, but the rest of our team, because we own the calendar. To me, this is really a critical piece, that we own how our meeting culture is, how we identify our meeting culture, how do we push it going forward, and how do we help our teams become more engaged and not less engaged because they're just tired of being on camera. Does anybody have any questions around or ideas around intentional meeting culture? I know this is a really new topic for a lot of people, so I kind of want to pause here for a little bit. It's okay, you can say yes, no. So we can talk about it, we can deep dive into it. If you guys have questions, we can deep dive into it a little bit more. Part 2, I think, is really important with our tools and technology. Let me ask you guys this. Are you guys in Microsoft, most of you guys in Microsoft, or are you in G Suite? Put M for Microsoft or G for G Suite. I love it. Yes. Normally, we have a good mix, but it doesn't look like we have anybody that's in G Suite. Okay, so For now, unless somebody else calls it out differently, I will focus more on Teams and less on Slack. But to me, I think the really big piece when you're thinking about the ecosystem is that the ecosystem, especially when you're talking about Microsoft, is really powerful when it's integrated and used together. But it starts to get broken when we are trying to piecemeal and use other tools instead of using the entire ecosystem together. So my really big tips are demonstrating the best practices for your teams, which also means that you have to learn and become the master of that ecosystem. So understanding the right tools for the right thing, I think, is really important. Deep diving into how many of you guys are actively using Teams? I would say probably most of you, if you're all remote, but yeah. So it would be really great when we get into the Q&A to maybe deep dive into some of those best practices. And then really also kind of demonstrating to your team, if there are questions, keep pushing them back on, for example, one of the things that I hear all the time is people start to use the @mention. Is anybody else a favorite of the @mention? Which is a great thing to use, except if someone is using O365 exclusively, it creates a task for that person every single time somebody hits an @mention. So it is really important that as administrative professionals, we understand all of those nuances so we can help demonstrate that for our team and kind of give them tips and tricks so that they're able to utilize the tools and technology in a way that's not pushing them into information overload. Number 3 is workflow optimization, which is, I'm super passionate about this topic. This is really where we prioritize our own work, where we're managing and funneling our workflow in such a way that we're limiting our contextual switching, that we're focusing on the deep and heavy work. We're kind of pushing FOMO to the side, and we're able to be refreshed, really just because we are determining versus letting someone else determine how we work, when we work, and at what level we're doing that. How many of you guys are actively managing your own workflow remotely versus somebody else sort of saying, hey, I need this now? So Vanessa, so FOMO is fear of missing out. So I think a lot of us really struggle with, and this is not exclusive to our function, but I think a lot of us really deal with, if someone sends us an email, a lot of us feel this urgency that we have to reply right the second, even if it's not a top priority. And I think what really can, and this really kind of gets into number 5, but when we don't determine and have our own optimization on how we work, a lot of times other people are able to dictate, and then we can't focus in onto the deep work, and then we have a lot of contextual switching, and we end up doing a lot more mental energy versus if we just kind of hone in and we determine when and how we're going to do the work. Okay, so number 4 is, I think this is really interesting. So I don't know about you, but what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing a lot of people right now are sort of saying like, hey, I'd love to see some more ideas for interesting ways to get people involved online, or virtual meetings or happy hours. Where I think this can also be challenging, and especially in our function, is I think sometimes we have a bird's eye view as to how many people are really struggling with the amount of those, and creating opportunities that are authentic versus sort of, hey, it feels like we should do something fun at every meeting, or how often is our team really meeting, and do we need to give them opportunities to actually step away from that and not be as engaged on a screen, and then also putting places like opportunities for them to provide that feedback so that your team can make adjustments so that people are not feeling overwhelmed. And then number 5 is defining how we work. So most of us, this is kind of where we're going to get into talking about our collaborative agreement. And kind of going back to what I referenced earlier, when organizations decide that they're going to go fully remote, most of them put these processes in place, and they understand the importance of defining collaboration agreements and how people are going to work together. But when the whole world goes remote overnight, becomes really challenging because these things are not set in place and people are just spinning their wheels. And I do think this is an opportunity for us as administrative professionals, because Most of us are not doing travel and expenses right now. And well, we're definitely not, most of us are not doing traveling. So it is an opportunity for us to think about how do we provide value? And I think that this is one way that right now is an immediate win for us. And really what that is setting up clear processes, agreeing with everyone on how we work, starting the conversations that acknowledge the differences on how we work, and also the demands that's on everybody's plate. Most organizations are kind of feeling that pressure, but nobody's really stepping up and talking about it. So I think this is a really great opportunity for us as administrative professionals to raise our hand and get in there and sort of help provide a solution for everyone. Alrighty, guys. So before we move on, any questions on tips 1 through 5? Before we'll do a Q&A later, but if you guys want me to dive into something now, we can. Alrighty.
Actually, Melissa.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question on the contextual switching, because some days I have problems with that since, you know, I'm reacting to things other people are asking of me versus when I'm driving my own schedule and what I'm working on.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, I think that contextual switching to me is a really big problem for administrative professionals because it's something that we're used to. We're kind of used to, and if we're being really honest, especially those that have been doing this for a long time, we're very proud of the fact that we are able to multitask in such a way that we get stuff done, but science doesn't back it. As much as we want to say it, science is very clear that when we do that amount of contextual switching, it takes us, they say, up to 21 minutes for your brain to get back on the thing that you were doing before you were interrupted. When I did Jeremy Burroughs' podcast like last year or the year, I forget how long, it's been a while, it's been a minute. But that was actually one of the questions he'd asked me, like my biggest screw up. And I was like, okay, really? Do I have to share this with the world? But it was because one of my personal biggest screw ups as an EA happened because I was contextual switching in the middle of planning a pretty big international travel. And I allowed somebody sort of to interrupt me in the middle of that, and it almost went horribly bad. But I do think it's important for us to determine on when we allow and how do we allow that to happen, and it's got to be something that you're aware of. If you follow me, and I'm sure you've heard about this, Jessica, but so I really believed in activators and strategists and people, the way that they approach their work. I don't know about you guys, but just watching other executives, oh, thank you, Melissa. Other executives that I have watched, I just sort of notice how they process information, how they give it. And I really believe that people process things one of two ways, either very strategically and they're really intentional with how they use their time and what they focus on, or you have someone who is more of an activator and they are sort of those people who are like rapid fire emails, they're always on their phone. And I think you have to build strategies around whichever one that you are so that you can be really productive with your time, energy, and focus. So yes, I have lots of ideas to help you with your contextual switching. So maybe when we get in the Q&A, we can deep dive into the activator and strategist. So we can, maybe figure out which one you are, Jessica. Okay, so let's get over into, so these are some of my favorite tips that are, and again, since a lot of everyone, I don't think I missed anybody that was on G Suite. So we'll focus in mostly on Teams. Is anyone on Slack? If you are, can you put an S? If you're on Slack? No? Okay. So we'll focus in a lot on Teams today instead of Slack and some of the other tools. So some of my biggest pet peeves I think that people really struggle with is the use of channels. So I always encourage teams to understand that when you're kind of building out your team's framework, that you need to start simple and let it grow organically. It gets to the point where there are and I think that we should, we need to recognize that information overload is absolutely a thing. it is really important that our team is, you know, I know people that are a part of 20 different teams, and they just stop using the tool because they feel like I can't keep up with all the information that's coming my way, which is the exact opposite of how we want these tools to impact how we work. So allowing things to grow organically, I like to always encourage people to create a channel that's specifically for tips, tricks, channel guidelines, and the team collaboration agreement. I think that thinking through, especially if you've just now started using Teams, it may not feel very confusing now, but it will in a year or 6 months from now, when you can't find anything and everything is sort of discombobulated because there was really no plan put in place on how you use channels and how you're using some of the tools and technology that is built into it. And then I think one of the really interesting things too is to get people away from using email as and I think, you know, they say right now about 95% of organizations are still using email as their main way of communication. And you're really trying to push that back into utilizing a collaborative tool. And most of the tools out there, you can integrate your emails into your channel, which I think is really great. You can also integrate meetings into channels. So there's some really powerful tools that will sort of help people, you know, pull that into Teams versus doing it versus email. And then kind of going back to the whole thing about information overload, to me, what I see a lot is that people are sometimes hesitant to configure their notifications, either because we feel the need that if someone messages us or if they email us that we have to respond right away. How many of you guys know in Teams, this is actually something that's happened within the last few months, but in Teams, it automatically defaults that it shows a red message. Now, not all of us want that, that red message shown, right? Sometimes we don't need everybody to know that we've seen it, we just haven't had a chance to get to you yet. So even kind of deep diving into some of those settings, I think can really be important for us so that we, again, are managing our own, and as well for the team, right? A lot of times we don't need everybody to know when we've seen. It's up to you to decide, but it is, I think, important to kind of go through all of those settings and configure it so that it works for you and not against you. Another way that you can avoid information overload is to use subject lines whenever you start a new conversation. So I think being really intentional on whether or not you are replying to a message or starting a new conversation. That is one way that 6 months from now, you're not going to be able to use your Teams or your Slack just because it's so overloaded because you're starting a new conversation every time versus just simply replying to the one that was already started. And then I think to me, what's really important as you're building and showing yourself as a master of these ecosystems, understanding best practices so that you can then teach your teams. I have a lot of clients who will take this and then they will, you know, once a week or once a month in staff meeting or whatever, they'll show some of their team best practices so that, you know, it's great if one person knows how to do it, but it's really impactful if everyone is learning best practices. So that's definitely a way that I suggest we can level up. And then, of course, I mentioned this earlier, but staying within the ecosystem is really critical. And then doing your part to encourage adoption of collaborative tools and technology. I like to say that, you know, there are, especially when you're in Microsoft, there are tools for almost everything. Now, whether or not we're using them the right way for the right tools is not always the case. So just really kind of think that through and then get people on board who are willing to help drive adoption across your team. So then tips 4 through 8 are manage the noise. This is an opportunity for you to decide when and how you're getting notified. The importance of sharing files appropriately. If you're in the Microsoft environment, the way that you organize this. How many of you guys know that when you create a Teams, you actually create a SharePoint site? Yes, if you knew that. So this can become super powerful for you, especially like when you're thinking about announcements and how you're managing things. You can really be intentional with how you're organizing things, but if you're not aware that these are available to you, sometimes you kind of miss out on that stuff. All the tools have an opportunity for you to do a save and a remind me, which I absolutely love, so that if you take time and you're kind of reading through some of your collaborative tools, you can go in and mark it so that you can either be reminded later or it's saved so that you can go back and read it, which is great when you're being intentional about your contextual switching. Make sure that you go in and, again, this is across the board, you can configure your do not disturb so that certain people are allowed to get a hold of you. And I think that this is something that people don't use enough. If it's important for us to go on do not disturb, again, if we're kind of limiting our contextual switching, having that functionality so that people are not just able to get a hold of us whenever they want to, but there are people that, you know, for example, if you're supporting an executive, you want them to be able to contact you whenever they need you. So kind of going in and updating all of those functions. And then I always suggest keep building habits. You're not going to wake up in the morning and suddenly do all of these things perfectly. So building a productivity plan and that you're building onto all these habits, to me, is really important.